What do narcissistic people do when they know they're guilty? Not when they're accused unfairly, not when there's confusion, but when they know exactly what they did. They know the evidence exists, and they know they have been caught. The answer surprises many people, because most people assume guilt leads to accountability. With narcissistic patterns, guilt often leads to strategy. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, denial is often the very first response you will see. This is not the same as an ordinary person denying something out of fear, embarrassment, or a momentary inability to face a mistake. In narcissistic patterns, denial serves a much deeper purpose. Admitting wrongdoing threatens the image they have carefully built of themselves as superior, admirable, competent, or morally right. Because that image is so important to them, accepting responsibility can feel intolerable. As a result, they may reject facts that seem obvious to everyone else. Even when confronted with clear evidence, screenshots, messages, recordings, or witness accounts, they may continue insisting that the event never happened or that you are completely mistaken. What makes this behavior so confusing is the confidence with which it is delivered. Most people assume that someone who is confronted with undeniable proof will eventually acknowledge reality. Instead, the narcissistic person may double down, speaking with certainty and conviction, even when the truth is standing directly in front of them. They are not focused on finding an accurate understanding of what happened. Their attention is focused on avoiding shame, preserving control, and protecting their self-image. If admitting guilt feels like a threat to their identity, denial becomes a defensive shield. Over time, this can leave the people around them feeling frustrated, confused, and emotionally exhausted. They may begin wondering whether they explained themselves poorly or whether more evidence is needed. Yet the problem is rarely a lack of evidence. The denial continues because accepting the truth would require the narcissistic person to face responsibility, and that is often the very thing they are trying hardest to avoid. When denial is no longer enough, a narcissistic person who knows they are guilty often moves to the next strategy: rewriting history. This is one of the most confusing experiences for anyone dealing with narcissistic behavior, because it can make you question events that once seemed completely clear. Rather than admitting what happened, they begin altering the story in subtle or dramatic ways. Conversations are remembered differently. Promises are suddenly denied. Important details disappear, and new explanations appear that were never mentioned before. The goal is not necessarily to create a believable version of events. The goal is to create enough uncertainty that accountability becomes difficult. A narcissistic person may take an incident that was straightforward and transform it into something far more complicated. If they lied, they may claim they were misunderstood. If they broke an agreement, they may insist no agreement ever existed. If they said something hurtful, they may argue that their words were taken out of context. Facts that make them look responsible are minimized, while details that make them appear innocent are exaggerated. Over time, the original event becomes buried beneath layers of revision and reinterpretation. What makes this tactic especially effective is that most people naturally assume that memory differences are normal. Because of this, they often give the narcissistic person the benefit of the doubt. They may revisit old conversations, replay situations in their mind, and wonder whether they remembered things incorrectly. This creates confusion and shifts attention away from the actual behavior. Instead of discussing what happened, the discussion becomes a debate about whose version of reality is correct. By changing the narrative, the narcissistic person attempts to protect their image and reduce the likelihood of being held responsible for their actions. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, blame shifting often becomes one of their most powerful tools. Instead of addressing their own behavior, they redirect attention towards someone else, usually the person confronting them. The moment accountability enters the conversation, the focus begins to move away from what they did and toward what you supposedly did wrong. This shift can happen so quickly that many people do not even realize it is occurring. What started as a discussion about their dishonesty, betrayal, disrespect, or manipulation suddenly becomes a discussion about your flaws, mistakes, reactions, or shortcomings. For example, if you confront them about lying, they may accuse you of being too suspicious. If you bring up a broken promise, they may criticize the way you communicated your concerns. If you point out hurtful behavior, they may remind you of a mistake you made months or even years ago. The original issue becomes lost in a maze of accusations and distractions. Instead of explaining their actions, they place you in a position where you feel compelled to defend yourself. This tactic works because it creates emotional confusion. Most people enter difficult conversations expecting both sides to discuss the problem honestly. When blame is suddenly redirected toward them, they often become defensive and begin explaining or justifying themselves. The narcissistic person benefits from this shift because attention is no longer focused on their behavior. The conversation changes from an examination of their actions to an examination of yours. Over time, repeated blame shifting can make a person feel responsible for problems they did not create. They may start believing that if they had acted differently, the narcissistic person's behavior would not have occurred. In reality, blame shifting is often less about finding the truth and more about escaping responsibility by placing the burden of guilt onto someone else. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, gaslighting often becomes more intense because it serves as a way to protect them from accountability. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation in which someone repeatedly causes another person to doubt their own perceptions, memories, judgments, and understanding of reality. Rather than addressing the issue directly, the narcissistic person attempts to make you question whether the issue exists at all. This can be especially confusing because it does not always happen through obvious lies. Often, it occurs through persistent contradiction, dismissal, and distortion of events.
You may clearly remember a conversation, a promise, or a specific action that took place. The narcissistic person may insist that it never happened, that you misunderstood what was said, or that you are remembering it incorrectly. If you provide evidence, they may attack the way you interpreted the situation rather than addressing the evidence itself. They might tell you that you are too sensitive, too emotional, overreacting, or imagining problems that do not exist. The discussion gradually shifts away from their behavior and toward your ability to perceive reality accurately. What makes gaslighting particularly damaging is that it works slowly over time. A single disagreement may not have much impact, but repeated exposure can create significant self-doubt. You may start replaying conversations in your mind, second-guessing your memory, and seeking reassurance from others about events you once felt certain about. The more uncertain you become, the easier it is for the narcissistic person to maintain control of the narrative. For the narcissistic person, gaslighting is often a way to avoid responsibility without directly admitting fault. If they can convince you to question your own reality, then they no longer have to defend their actions. The focus moves away from what they did and on to whether your perception of the situation can be trusted. And if this conversation is helping you make sense of experiences that once felt impossible to understand, take a moment to engage with it, because these discussions help more people recognize unhealthy dynamics before they become deeply trapped in them. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, one of the most surprising reactions is their tendency to position themselves as the victim. This can be deeply confusing because the person who caused the harm suddenly begins acting as though they are the one who has been wronged. Instead of focusing on the pain, disappointment, or consequences experienced by others, they redirect attention toward their own emotional distress. The conversation gradually shifts away from accountability and toward sympathy for them. This victim stance can take many forms. They may talk about how overwhelmed they feel, how much pressure they are under, or how unfairly they are being treated. They might describe themselves as misunderstood, attacked, judged, or persecuted. In some cases, they may even suggest that confronting them about their behavior is more hurtful than the behavior itself. The original issue becomes overshadowed by their emotional reaction to being held responsible. What makes this tactic so effective is that many people are naturally compassionate. When someone appears distressed, most individuals instinctively want to comfort them, understand them, and reduce their suffering. A narcissistic person can take advantage of this tendency by shifting the emotional spotlight onto themselves. Instead of discussing the damage they caused, everyone ends up discussing their feelings about being confronted. Over time, this pattern can create a cycle in which accountability becomes nearly impossible. Every attempt to address a problem is met with stories about their struggles, their pain, or their hardships. The person who was harmed may even begin feeling guilty for bringing up legitimate concerns. They may find themselves apologizing, backing down, or minimizing their own experiences just to restore peace. By adopting the role of the victim, the narcissistic person often avoids the uncomfortable task of examining their behavior. Attention, sympathy, and emotional energy are redirected toward them, allowing responsibility to fade into the background, while their need for protection and validation remains at the center of the interaction. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, protecting their public image often becomes a higher priority than addressing the harm they caused. This leads to what can be called an image management campaign. Rather than focusing on repair, they focus on controlling how other people perceive the situation. Because narcissistic individuals frequently rely on admiration, approval, status, or reputation to maintain their sense of self, exposure can feel threatening. If their behavior becomes known, the carefully constructed image they present to others may be damaged. This process often happens behind the scenes. They may begin talking to friends, family members, co-workers, or mutual acquaintances before you even realize it is occurring. Instead of giving a balanced account, they selectively share information that supports their version of events. Important context may be omitted. Your reactions may be highlighted while their actions are minimized, and details that make them look responsible may disappear entirely. Sometimes they do not need to tell obvious lies. They simply present a partial story that creates a favorable impression. A common feature of image management is preemptive framing. If they suspect they may be confronted or exposed, they may quietly establish themselves as the reasonable, misunderstood, or injured party before others hear the full story. This can make it difficult for the person who was harmed to be believed later, because people have already been given a narrative that casts the narcissistic person in a positive light. The emotional impact can be significant. You may discover that others seem to know a very different version of what happened. Relationships can become strained, and you may feel isolated or misunderstood. The narcissistic person benefits from this confusion because maintaining external validation helps protect their identity and reduces the social consequences of their behavior. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, deflection often becomes one of their most effective methods for avoiding accountability. Unlike blame shifting, which redirects responsibility onto someone else, deflection works by moving attention away from the issue altogether. The goal is not necessarily to prove innocence. The goal is to prevent the conversation from staying focused on the behavior that needs to be addressed. If the discussion never remains on the original topic long enough, meaningful accountability becomes difficult to achieve. Deflection can take many forms. A narcissistic person may suddenly change the subject when confronted with uncomfortable facts. They may bring up an unrelated problem, introduce a new conflict, or focus on a completely different event. If you ask a direct question, they may respond with something only loosely connected to what was asked. Instead of discussing their actions, they create distractions that pull the conversation in multiple directions. Before long, the original concern becomes buried beneath side issues and emotional detours. What makes deflection particularly frustrating is that it can appear reasonable on the surface. The new topics may sound important, and the concerns they raise may even contain some truth. However, the timing is what matters. These issues often emerge precisely when attention is focused on their behavior. As a result, the discussion becomes scattered and unproductive. Many people do not recognize deflection immediately because they enter conversations expecting cooperation and problem solving. They naturally follow the new topic, hoping to resolve every issue that is raised. Hours later, they may realize that the original problem was never addressed at all. The conversation feels exhausting, yet nothing meaningful has been accomplished. For the narcissistic person, deflection serves as a shield against accountability. By constantly redirecting attention, they prevent sustained examination of their actions and create enough confusion to avoid facing the consequences of what they have done. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, one of the most confusing reactions can be the sudden appearance of charm, kindness, affection, or even what seems like genuine remorse. After denying, blaming, gaslighting, or avoiding responsibility, they may unexpectedly become warm, attentive, and apologetic. For someone who has been hurt by their behavior, this shift can feel like a breakthrough. It may seem as though they have finally recognized the damage they caused and are ready to make things right. However, understanding the motivation behind this behavior is essential. In healthy relationships, apologies are usually connected to self-reflection, empathy, and a sincere desire to repair harm. The person acknowledges what they did, accepts responsibility, and demonstrates change through consistent actions. A narcissistic person, however, may use charm and apologies primarily as a strategy to reduce consequences, regain control, or restore access to a relationship that is slipping away. The focus is often on ending the conflict rather than understanding the impact of their behavior. They may say exactly what the other person has been longing to hear. They may express regret, promise change, become unusually attentive, or temporarily behave in ways that feel loving and reassuring. This can create hope and make the injured person believe that meaningful transformation is finally taking place. The emotional relief that follows can be powerful, especially after a long period of tension or confusion. The key difference lies in what happens after the apology. If the underlying attitudes and behaviors remain unchanged, the cycle often repeats itself. The charm fades, old patterns return, and new excuses emerge when problems arise again. In these situations, the apology functions less as a commitment to growth and more as a tool for restoring stability, protecting self-interest, and avoiding the lasting consequences that genuine accountability would require. When narcissistic people know they're guilty, their reactions often reveal something important. Their primary focus is not repairing the damage they've caused, but protecting themselves from the discomfort of accountability. Whether it's denial, rewriting history, blame shifting, gaslighting, playing the victim, managing their image, deflecting conversations, or suddenly becoming charming and apologetic. Each behavior serves the same underlying purpose: to avoid facing responsibility and preserve their self-image. Understanding these patterns is not about labeling every difficult person as a narcissist or becoming suspicious of everyone around you. It's about recognizing behaviors that keep you trapped in confusion, self-doubt, and endless attempts to get someone to acknowledge what happened. The more clearly you see these patterns, the less power they have over you. You do not need another person's permission to trust your own experiences. You do not need endless explanations to validate what you know is true. And you do not need someone else's accountability in order to establish your own boundaries. Real healing often begins when you stop chasing the admission, apology, or understanding you've been hoping for, and start focusing on your own clarity, self-respect, and emotional well-being. The greatest defense against manipulation is not winning an argument. It is seeing the pattern for what it is. Because once you can recognize these behaviors without getting pulled into them, you become far less vulnerable to their influence. And that is where real freedom begins. Not when they finally admit what they did, but when their refusal to do so no longer controls your peace.